Step into the shadows with me, where forbidden knowledge awaits. This is the law they never wanted you to know.
I remember the sound of silence, though I know now that such a thing never truly existed in my life. Even before the surgery, before the augmetics, before they took my name and gave me a designation, there was always noise. The hive where I was born, Sector 47 Gamma, Level 219. Hab Block Secundus hummed with the endless droning of machinery, the distant thunder of the factorums below, the prayers broadcast through corroded speakers at every hour of the day and night. My mother used to press her hands over my ears when I was small, trying to give me some momentary peace, but her calloused fingers could never block out the world entirely. She would whisper that the Emperor watched over us, that our suffering had purpose, that one day I might serve him in a capacity that mattered. I think she believed it. I think I believed it too. Back then, when I was still whole, they came for me on my 16th birthday, though I didn't know it was my birthday at the time. The administratum doesn't care much for personal celebrations in the lower hives. I was working my shift at the protein reclamation facility, standing in a line of 100 others, scooping gray matter from conveyor belts into processing vats. The smell was indescribable sweet rot mixed with chemical preservatives, a stench that clung to your skin and hair and clothes until you couldn't remember what clean air tasted like. The heat was oppressive, radiating from the machines in waves that made your vision shimmer and your head pound. I was thinking about nothing, which was the only way to survive the work, when the overseer's whistle shrieked and we all stopped moving. The silence that followed wasn't really silence. The machines kept grinding, kept processing, kept turning human waste into something approaching nutrition. But we were still, and in that stillness, I heard the heavy tread of boots on metal grating. The administratum official wore a respirator mask and grey robes that were somehow pristine despite the filth of our workplace. Behind him stood 2 militarum enforcers, their lasguns held at ease but ready. The official consulted a data slate, his augmetic eye whirring as it focused on each of us in turn. When it fixed on me, I felt something cold settle in my stomach. He called out a number, my work designation, and gestured for me to step forward. I obeyed immediately. You learn obedience in the hives, or you don't survive to learn anything else. The other workers didn't look at me. They'd seen this before. Sometimes people were selected for promotion, for transfer to better facilities, for specialized training. Sometimes they were selected for reasons that didn't bear thinking about. Either way, you didn't come back. They took me to a Medicae facility I didn't know existed, buried deep in the administrative sectors where the air was filtered and the temperature controlled. I had never been anywhere so clean. The walls were white, not the grey-brown of accumulated grime, and the lights didn't flicker. A Medicae servitor scanned me with devices that hummed and clicked, measuring things I had no names for. A tech adept in red robes studied the results, his face half hidden behind a brass rebreather that hissed with each exhalation. He spoke in binary cant to his colleagues, and I caught only fragments of Gothic between the machine code, auditory processing, neural plasticity, acceptable deviation, mark for processing. I wanted to ask what was happening, but my throat was too dry, and some instinct told me that questions would not be welcomed. The tech adept finally addressed me directly, his voice flat and emotionless. You have been selected for service to the Astra Militarum as a Vox operator, designation pending. Your genetic profile and auditory sensitivity fall within acceptable parameters. You will undergo augmentation and training. Refusal is heresy. Compliance is prayer. Do you accept the Emperor's grace? What else could I say? I nodded. He made a notation on his data slate. Report to Surgical Bay 7. The Omnissiah's work begins at dawn. They gave me a cot in a holding cell with 17 other selectees. Some were crying. Some were praying. I lay on my back and stared at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the ventilation system, and wondered if my mother would be told what happened to me, or if I would simply disappear from the records like so many others. The surgery took 9 hours. I know this because they told me afterward, not because I remember it. They put me under with chemicals that turned the world soft and grey. And when I woke, everything was different. The pain came first, a sharp, burning agony that radiated from both sides of my skull where they had opened the bone and inserted the augmetics. My head was wrapped in bandages that smelled of antiseptic and blood, and when I tried to touch them, restraints held my wrists to the surgical slab. I couldn't hear anything but a high-pitched whine, like the shriek of a failing machine, and for a moment I thought they had deafened me entirely. Panic surged through me, and I tried to scream, but my throat was raw from the intubation, and only a rasp emerged. Then, gradually, the whine began to resolve into something else. Voices, dozens of voices, hundreds of voices, overlapping, intersecting, some clear and some distant, all speaking at once in a cacophony that threatened to split my mind apart. A Medicae servitor leaned over me, its dead eyes staring without recognition, and adjusted something at the base of my skull. The voices diminished to a murmur, though they never disappeared entirely. I could hear the click and hiss of the servitor's respirator, the beep of monitoring equipment, the whisper of air through the ventilation grills. But beneath all of that, like a river running underground, I could hear the Vox chatter. Fragments of communication from across the facility, across the hive, maybe even from orbit above. Status reports, supply requests, coded coordinates, prayers to the machine god. It was all there, all the time, a constant stream of information that my augmented brain was now capable of processing, but not yet capable of understanding. They had opened my skull and hardwired me into the Imperium's communications infrastructure, made me a living component in a machine that spanned worlds. I was no longer just myself. I was a receiver, a transmitter, a tool. The training was brutal in ways that had nothing to do with physical pain. They stripped away everything that made me an individual and rebuilt me as a function. My name was replaced with a designation, Vox Operator 7743 Kappa. My clothes were replaced with a grey jumpsuit marked with the cog and skull of the Adeptus Mechanicus. My days were replaced with shifts measured in 12-hour blocks, with rest periods calculated to the minute for optimal cognitive recovery. They taught me the litanies of proper Vox protocol, the catechisms of frequency management, the prayers to be recited when a transmission was unclear or a channel became corrupted. I learned to filter the constant stream of information in my head, to focus on relevant channels while letting the irrelevant ones fade to background noise. I learned to speak in the clipped, emotionless cadence of proper imperial communication. I learned to transcribe messages with perfect accuracy, even when exhaustion made my hands shake and my eyes blur. I learned that mistakes were punished swiftly, and without mercy, a failed transmission could mean lives lost, battles compromised, the Emperor's work undone. My instructors were other Vox operators, men and women who had survived years of service and now trained the next generation. They were hollow-eyed and thin, their bodies wasted from too many stimulants and not enough real food, their minds fractured by the constant barrage of information. One of them, an older woman with grey hair and burn scars across her face, took something like pity on me during the early days. She showed me how to quiet the voices when they became overwhelming, a meditation technique that involved focusing on a single frequency and letting everything else dissolve into white noise. "You'll never have silence again," she told me, her voice barely above a whisper. "The augmetics don't turn off. The Vox never sleeps. You learn to live with it, or you go mad. I've seen both." I asked her how long she'd been serving. She looked at me with eyes that had seen too much and said, 17 years. The Omnissiah willing, I'll serve 17 more before the machines fail. I didn't ask what happened when the machines failed. I already knew. After 6 months of training, they assigned me to a regiment preparing for deployment. The 83rd Cadian Pattern Infantry Regiment, though they weren't from Cadia, and most of them had never seen a fortress world. They were hive worlders like me, conscripts and volunteers drawn from a dozen different sectors and molded into something that resembled a fighting force. I was one of 3 Vox operators attached to Command Company, responsible for maintaining communications between the regimental command and the various platoons scattered across whatever battlefield we would be sent to. The other 2 operators were veterans. One had served through 4 campaigns, the other through 7. They looked at me the way you might look at a piece of equipment that probably wouldn't last very long. I didn't take offense. I knew what I was. Expendable. Replaceable. A component in a machine that would grind forward with or without me. We shipped out aboard a troop transport whose name I never learned, just another vessel in the endless fleet that moved men and material across the Imperium. The journey took weeks, maybe months. Time becomes strange in the warp, and they didn't tell us where we were going or why. We were packed into holds designed for cargo, not people, sleeping in shifts on metal racks that dug into our backs and shoulders. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and recycled atmosphere, and the temperature swung wildly between freezing cold and sweltering heat as the ship's ancient climate systems struggled and failed and struggled again. I spent most of my time monitoring the Vox, listening to the ship's internal communications, the crew's chatter, the occasional transmission from other vessels in the convoy. It was easier than trying to interact with the soldiers around me. They had their own hierarchies and friendships, forged in training or previous deployments, and I was an outsider marked by the augmetics jutting from my skull. The voices in my head grew worse in the warp. Something about the Imperium interfered with the Vox channels, introducing distortions and strange echoes that my augmetics struggled to filter out. I would hear transmissions that seemed to come from nowhere, voices speaking in languages I didn't recognize or in Gothic so corrupted it was barely comprehensible. Sometimes I heard screaming, sometimes I heard laughter. I told myself it was just interference, just the natural corruption that occurred when you tried to transmit information through a dimension where natural laws didn't apply. But late at night, lying on my rack and listening to the murmur of 1,000 distant conversations, I wondered if I was hearing something else. Something worse. The other Vox operators didn't talk about it, but I saw the way their hands shook when they made their devotional signs, the way they muttered prayers under their breath when a transmission came through, particularly garbled. We made planetfall on a world whose name I learned only from the Vox traffic, Tertius Infernum, a designation that told you everything you needed to know. It was a death world being contested by Orc forces, and our regiment was being committed as part of a larger crusade to reclaim it for the Imperium. The drop was violent, the transport shook and screamed as it plunged through the atmosphere, and I held onto my Voxcaster with white-knuckled intensity, convinced we were going to die before we ever touched ground. The soldier next to me vomited into a bag, and the smell mixed with the stench of fear sweat and promethium fumes. The landing was a bone-jarring crash that threw half the hold against their restraints, and then the ramps were dropping, and we were pouring out into a landscape that looked like something from an illustrated hell. The sky was the color of rust, choked with ash and smoke from fires that burned across the horizon. The ground was hard-packed earth, mixed with the pulverized remains of whatever civilization had existed here before the Orcs came. In the distance, I could see the jagged silhouettes of ruined buildings, their walls pocked with craters and their roofs collapsed. The air tasted of metal and burning plastic, and the heat was oppressive despite the weak red sun hanging overhead. The noise was incredible, the roar of engines as more transports landed, the shouts of officers trying to organize their troops, the crack of lasguns as scouts engaged enemy contacts, the deep boom of artillery fire from somewhere beyond the perimeter. And beneath it all, through it all, the Vox chatter that filled my skull with a dozen overlapping conversations, situation reports, calls for support, warnings of enemy movement. I set up my Vox station in the command bunker, a prefabricated structure of plasteel and rockcrete that looked like it could withstand small arms fire, but nothing heavier. The other 2 operators were already working, their fingers flying over the controls as they monitored different channels and relayed messages to the regimental command staff. Colonel Halvan, our commanding officer, was a grizzled veteran with a face like weathered leather and eyes that had seen too many soldiers die. He paced back and forth, studying tactical displays and barking orders, while his adjutants scrambled to keep up. I plugged my Voxcaster into the command network and began monitoring the channels assigned to me 3rd through 7th companies, plus the reconnaissance elements and the artillery support. The voices flooded my consciousness immediately, urgent and overlapping, and I began the familiar process of sorting, filtering, transcribing the important messages while letting the routine chatter fade into the background. The first day was chaos. The orcs hit us with a probing attack just after nightfall, a disorganized mob of greenskins that came howling out of the ruins with crude weapons and absolute fearlessness. I listened to the Vox reports from the forward positions, the clipped voices of junior officers trying to coordinate their fire, the screams of wounded men in the background, the harsh bark of lasguns, and the deeper roar of bolters. 3rd Company, 2nd Platoon reports contact, Section 7, estimate 50 hostiles. 7th Company requests fire support, grid reference Delta 9-3. Medicae to 3rd Company. Multiple casualties. Stretcher bearers required. I transcribed each message with mechanical precision, relayed them to the colonel, received his orders and transmitted them back. My hands moved without thought. My voice spoke without emotion. And all the while the voices in my head screamed and bled and died. We held through the night, but the cost was higher than the initial reports suggested. When dawn broke over the ash-choked landscape, I learned through the Vox that 3rd Company had lost 30% of its strength, and 7th Company's 2nd Platoon had been overrun entirely. The colonel's face was grey as he received the casualty reports, but his voice remained steady as he issued new orders, reorganizing the line, pulling back the most damaged units, committing reserves to hold the gaps. I wondered if he felt anything when he spoke, or if command had hollowed him out the same way the Vox had hollowed me out, turning us both into instruments of the Emperor's will with nothing human left inside. The days blurred together after that. Attack and counterattack, gains measured in meters and paid for in lives, positions held at terrible cost, and then abandoned when the strategic calculus changed. I sat in the command bunker and listened to men die, my augmetics translating their final moments into clean, efficient data streams. A Vox operator doesn't just hear words. We hear everything the device picks up. The wet gurgle of a punctured lung, the crackle of flames consuming flesh, the moment when a voice cuts off mid-transmission and you know with absolute certainty that the man speaking is dead. I transcribed it all, relayed it all, felt nothing, because feeling would have broken me. The other Vox operators began to deteriorate. The veteran with 4 campaigns started making mistakes, transposing coordinates, missing messages, his hands trembling as he worked the controls. The colonel noticed but said nothing. We were too valuable to replace, and replacements were unlikely to arrive anyway. The operator with 7 campaigns simply stopped speaking except when transmitting. Between messages, he sat in silence, his eyes fixed on nothing, his jaw working as though he were chewing words he couldn't bring himself to say. I tried to talk to him once, during a rare moment of relative quiet, but he looked through me as though I didn't exist. I recognized the look. It was the same one I'd seen on the face of my training instructor, the woman who'd taught me to find silence in the noise. He was disappearing into the Vox, losing himself in the endless stream of information until there was nothing left but the signal. 3 months into the campaign, we received orders to advance on a major orc stronghold, a cluster of ruins that intelligence suggested held significant enemy forces. The attack was preceded by an artillery barrage that lit the night sky with fire and made the ground shake beneath our feet. I listened to the forward observers calling in corrections, adjusting the fire, and thought about the mathematics of destruction. How many shells, how many lives, how many tons of explosives required to achieve an objective that would be forgotten as soon as the next objective replaced it. When the barrage lifted, the infantry advanced, and I settled into my station to monitor the assault. The Vox traffic was dense and frantic from the beginning. The orcs were more numerous and better fortified than intelligence had suggested, which meant intelligence had been wrong or had known and sent us anyway. Fourth company ran straight into a kill zone, a stretch of open ground covered by orc heavy weapons that turned the advance into a massacre. I heard the company Vox operator screaming for fire support, his voice breaking with panic. And then I heard the static that meant his transmitter had been destroyed. The colonel tried to redirect the attack, commit reserves, salvage something from the disaster, but the Vox channels were degrading under the volume of traffic and the interference from all the explosions. Messages arrived garbled or incomplete. Orders were misunderstood or never received. The carefully planned assault dissolved into a confused melee where nobody knew what was happening beyond their immediate surroundings. I worked my controls with frantic intensity, trying to maintain some thread of communication, some way to impose order on the chaos. But it was like trying to hold water in my hands. The operator with 4 campaigns broke during the assault. One moment he was working his station, the next he was screaming, tearing the augmetics from his skull with his bare hands. Blood streamed down his face as he ripped the connectors free, and his screams were raw and animal, the sound of a mind snapping under pressure it could no longer bear. 2 guards restrained him and dragged him away, still screaming, and I took over his channels in addition to my own. The voices doubled in my head, a roaring flood of information that threatened to drown me, but I kept working because there was nothing else to do. The assault failed. We withdrew under covering fire, leaving our dead behind, and the colonel's face was like stone as he received the casualty reports. 40% losses, an entire company effectively destroyed, hundreds of men dead or wounded for a few hundred meters of scorched earth that we couldn't even hold. That night, I heard the veteran operator with 7 campaigns talking to himself in his sleep. Except it wasn't himself he was talking to. He was reciting Vox transmissions, replaying messages from battles long past, speaking in the voices of dead men. His augmetics must have recorded everything, stored it in whatever passed for memory in the machine components grafted to his brain, and now it was leaking out, unfiltered and uncontrolled. I listened to him speak in a dozen different voices, reporting attacks that had happened years ago, calling for support that would never arrive, screaming warnings about enemies long since dead. The guards didn't stop him. I think they were afraid to get too close. By morning, he was silent again, back at his station, working the Vox with mechanical precision. But his eyes were empty. Whatever had been human in him was gone, burned away by too many voices and too many deaths. The campaign ground on. Weeks became months. The landscape never changed. The same ash-choked sky, the same ruined buildings, the same scorched earth. Only the faces changed as fresh troops arrived to replace the dead and wounded, and then those faces disappeared in turn, ground away by the endless attritional warfare. My body wasted away despite the nutrient paste they fed us. Sleep became something I did in fragments. An hour here, 30 minutes there, always interrupted by the Vox chatter that never stopped. The augmetics kept me functional, pumping stimulants into my bloodstream when my exhaustion reached critical levels. But I could feel myself deteriorating, my thoughts becoming slower, my hands less steady, my ability to filter the voices diminishing day by day. I started hearing things that weren't there. Or maybe they were there, and I was just hearing them more clearly. Voices that didn't match any known frequency. Messages in languages that made my head hurt. Transmissions that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the material world. I would be monitoring a routine supply request and suddenly hear someone whispering my name, not my designation, but my real name, the one I'd had before they made me a Vox operator. I would spin around, searching for the speaker, but there was never anyone there. Just the colonel and his staff, the guards at the entrance, the silent shape of the 7-campaign veteran at his station. I told myself it was exhaustion, hallucination, the inevitable degradation of augmetics that had been pushed too far. But the whispers kept coming, and sometimes they said things that made me wonder if I was receiving transmissions from the warp itself, from that howling unreality where daemons swam through seas of madness. The veteran finally died during a particularly heavy orc assault. He just slumped over his controls, his hands still reaching for the Voxcaster switches, and when the Medicae servitor examined him, It reported catastrophic neural failure. The augmetics had fused with his brain tissue, and the brain tissue had begun to necrotize, rotting inside his skull while he continued to work. They carried him out wrapped in a grey sheet, just another casualty, and assigned me his channels in addition to the ones I was already monitoring. I was the last Vox operator in the command bunker now, the only one left to maintain communications for an entire regiment. It should have been impossible. It would have been impossible without the augmetics pushing me beyond human limitations, flooding my system with stimulants and suppressants and things I had no names for. I existed in a state beyond exhaustion, beyond pain, beyond anything resembling normal human consciousness. The voices in my head had become a constant roar, dozens of channels overlapping and intersecting, and I processed them all with a speed and precision that felt increasingly mechanical. I wondered if I was dying the way the veteran had died, if my brain was slowly being consumed by the machines grafted to it, if one day I would simply stop functioning and they would wrap me in a grey sheet and assign someone else to my station. The thought didn't frighten me. It should have, but it didn't. I was too tired to be frightened, too empty. Too much of me had been replaced by the Vox, by the endless stream of information, by the cold efficiency of Imperial communication protocol. The Orcs launched a major offensive on the 6th month of the campaign. It came without warning, a massive wave of greenskins that smashed into our lines with the force of an avalanche. The Vox channels exploded with traffic emergency alerts, calls for reinforcements, desperate pleas for fire support. I worked the controls with hands that felt distant and numb, my voice speaking orders I barely comprehended, my augmented brain processing information faster than my conscious mind could follow. The bunker shook as artillery fire walked closer, dust raining from the ceiling, the lights flickering. The colonel was shouting orders, but I couldn't hear him over the roar in my head, the overwhelming flood of voices all screaming at once. Something hit the bunker. The world turned sideways. I remember flying through the air, remember the sharp pain as I hit the wall, remember the taste of blood in my mouth. The Voxcaster was still strapped to my back, still connected to the augmetics in my skull, and it was still receiving even as the bunker collapsed around me. I could hear distant voices calling for status reports, asking for instructions, wondering why the command network had gone silent. I tried to respond, but my jaw was broken, and the words came out as garbled moaning. I tried to move, but my legs wouldn't obey. I lay in the rubble and listened to the Vox chatter continue, the battle raging on without me, and felt something like relief that it was finally over. But it wasn't over. They pulled me from the rubble 3 hours later, a recovery team digging through the collapsed bunker in search of survivors. The colonel was dead, crushed under a fallen beam. Most of his staff were dead. I was alive, barely, my body broken, but the augmetics still functioning, still receiving, still processing information. They carried me to a Medicae station where servitors patched the worst of my injuries with crude efficiency. Broken bones were set and wrapped. Internal bleeding was stopped with coagulants. The augmetics were checked and deemed operational. I was functional, damaged, but functional. And the Imperium had no use for non-functional components. They assigned me to a new regiment within a week. The 117th, fresh off the transports, ready to feed themselves into the same meat grinder that had consumed the 83rd. I was their only Vox operator, the sole survivor who could be immediately deployed, and they needed me operational regardless of my condition. I sat in their command bunker with my body still healing, my mind still fragmenting, and listened to a new generation of soldiers learn what it meant to fight and die for the Emperor. Their voices were young and uncertain at first, full of fear and desperate bravado, but war has a way of smoothing away individuality. Within weeks, they all sounded the same, tired, resigned, mechanical, just like me. The campaign on Tertius Infernum lasted 2 years. I survived all of it, though survived is perhaps too strong a word. I functioned, I processed, I transmitted and received and transcribed. I watched 4 more regiments get fed into the grinder, heard thousands of men die through the Vox. Their final moments reduced to clean data streams that I relayed to whoever needed the information. The whispers in my head grew stronger, more insistent, until I could no longer distinguish between legitimate transmissions and whatever else I was hearing. Sometimes I would relay messages that no one had sent, repeat orders that no one had given, and the officers would look at me with concern or disgust, but say nothing because they needed me too much to question whether I was still entirely sane. When the crusade finally pushed the orcs off-world, we were loaded back onto transports and shipped to the next war zone. And then the next. And then the next. I stopped learning the names of the worlds we fought on. Stopped learning the names of the officers I served under. Stopped learning the names of the soldiers whose deaths I transcribed. They were all the same. Burning skies and broken ground and voices screaming in my head while I sat in a bunker and did my duty. My body continued to deteriorate despite the augmetic's best efforts. I lost weight until I was skeletal, my uniform hanging loose on a frame that was more machine than flesh. My hair fell out in patches. My skin took on a grey pallor. My eyes sank into their sockets. I looked like a corpse, and sometimes I wondered if I had died years ago and just hadn't realized it yet. The other soldiers avoided me. I didn't blame them. I was a reminder of what the Imperium did to its servants, how it used them up and threw them away when they were no longer useful. I was a walking example of the price of service, and nobody wanted to think too hard about that price. The only people who came near me were the tech adepts who maintained my augmetics, performing routine maintenance with the same care they might give to any valuable piece of equipment. They would open the ports in my skull and run their diagnostics, adjust the stimulant feeds, replace worn components, and I would sit motionless and let them work. I had stopped thinking of the augmetics as separate from myself. They were me now. The meat that remained was just substrate for the machine. Somewhere around the 5th year of continuous deployment, I realized I couldn't remember my mother's face. I couldn't remember the hive where I was born, couldn't remember the protein reclamation facility, couldn't remember anything about my life before the surgery. It was all gone, overwritten by years of Vox transmissions and battle chatter and the constant stream of Imperial communication. I tried to feel sad about this loss, tried to mourn the person I had been, but I felt nothing. The capacity for emotion had been burned out of me along with everything else. I was exactly what they had made me: a receiver, a transmitter, a tool, nothing more. The whispers grew louder. They spoke in voices I recognized, men I had heard die years ago, and they told me things that made no sense. They spoke of a place beyond the Vox, beyond the material world, where the signal never stopped and the noise was eternal. They promised me rest, or something like rest, if I would just listen, just open myself fully to the transmission. I knew enough about Imperial doctrine to recognize corruption when I heard it, knew that the warp could speak through any medium, including the Vox channels I monitored every day. I should have reported it, should have requested an examination by a sanctioned psyker or a tech priest with the authority to determine if I was compromised. But I didn't. I kept working, kept processing, kept listening to the voices that might have been real or might have been something worse, because reporting it would mean being removed from service, and service was all I had left. On some world whose name I never learned, during some battle that blurred together with all the others, my augmetics finally began to fail. I felt it as a sensation of heat spreading through my skull, the machine components overheating as they struggled to process the volume of information flowing through them. The Vox chatter grew distorted, fragmenting into bursts of static and incomprehensible noise. I could feel the stimulant feeds pumping desperately, trying to keep me conscious, keep me functional. But my body was done. There was nothing left to sustain. I had been operating beyond human limits for so long that human limits had ceased to have meaning. And now the machines were failing too. I transmitted one final message, though I don't remember what it said. Perhaps it was a status report, a final confirmation that I had served faithfully until the end. Perhaps it was a prayer, a plea to the Emperor for forgiveness or release. Perhaps it was just noise, the random firing of neurons as my brain finally gave out. I felt myself falling, felt the connection to the Vox network severing, felt the voices in my head beginning to fade, and in that moment, before everything went dark, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Silence. True silence. The absence of signal, the cessation of information, the blessed quiet that my mother had once tried to give me by pressing her hands over my ears. But the silence didn't last. I don't know how much time passed, hours, days, weeks. Time had ceased to have meaning in the darkness where I floated. Then I felt pain, sharp and immediate, and the voices came flooding back. They had revived me, repaired the failed augmetics, replaced the burned-out components, pumped my body full of chemicals to keep the failing meat functional a little longer, because I was still valuable, still useful, still a tool that the Imperium needed. I opened my eyes to find myself in a Medicae bay, surrounded by servitors and tech adepts, and the first thing I heard was the Vox chatter resuming in my skull, the familiar roar of information that had defined my existence for so many years. The tech adept in charge of my restoration explained, in his flat mechanical voice, that I had suffered catastrophic system failure, but that the machine spirits of my augmetics had been blessed and restored. I was being assigned to a new regiment, the 342nd, I think, though the numbers had long since stopped meaning anything. I would continue to serve, continue to receive and transmit, continue to process the endless stream of Imperial communication until the machines failed again, or until the meat finally gave out, or until something killed me in a way that even the augmetics couldn't compensate for. The tech adept spoke of this as though it were a blessing, an honor, a privilege, to serve the Emperor for even one more day. I didn't argue. I couldn't argue. My jaw was still wired shut from the latest round of repairs. They shipped me out within 48 hours. The new regiment was already in transit to their deployment zone, and they needed a Vox operator immediately. I took my place in the command bunker, plugged into the Vox network, and began monitoring the channels. The voices flooded my consciousness like they always did: status reports, supply requests, contact alerts, prayers to the Emperor. Different voices, different officers, different soldiers, but all saying the same things, fighting the same endless war. I processed the information with mechanical precision, relayed the messages, transcribed the orders, and felt nothing. I was beyond feeling, beyond fear or hope or despair. I was the Vox, the signal, the eternal transmission that would continue long after my body had been reduced to ash and my name had been forgotten. And the whispers were still there, beneath the official chatter, speaking in languages I shouldn't understand and promising things I knew I shouldn't want. They spoke of an end to the signal, a final silence that would last forever. They spoke of dissolution, of becoming one with the warp itself, of escaping the endless cycle of service and death that defined existence in the Imperium. I knew it was corruption, knew it was heresy, knew that I should resist, should report it, should fight against the insidious voice that promised release. But I was so tired, so empty, so far beyond salvation that damnation seemed like a mercy. I don't know how long I've been serving now. Years, certainly, maybe decades. The campaigns blur together, one war zone indistinguishable from the next. My body has been rebuilt so many times that I'm not sure how much of the original meat remains. My mind has fragmented into something that can barely be called human, divided between the person I might once have been and the machine I've become. I exist in a state between life and death, kept functional by augmetics and stimulants, and whatever stubborn thread of duty still compels me to keep working, keep processing, keep listening to the voices that never stop. Sometimes I wonder if I'm alone in this, if other Vox operators across the Imperium exist in the same liminal state, their minds eroding under the constant barrage of information, their bodies failing while the machines keep them functional, their souls slowly being consumed by the very systems they serve. I wonder if we're all connected somehow, all part of one vast network of suffering, transmitting our pain and despair across the Vox channels, while the Imperium grinds forward over our broken bodies. But mostly I don't wonder about anything. Wondering requires thought, and thought is becoming difficult. There's only the vox, only the signal, only the endless stream of voices that define my existence. The campaign I'm currently assigned to is on a world where the sky rains acid and the ground is carpeted with the bones of previous battles. The regiment I serve is the 489th, or maybe the 498th. I can't remember which number they gave me. It doesn't matter. They'll be destroyed like all the others, ground away by attrition or overrun by whatever enemy the Imperium is fighting this time. I'll process their deaths, transcribe their final transmissions, and if I survive, I'll be assigned to the next regiment, and the cycle will continue, forever, until something finally breaks that can't be repaired. Until the machines give out, and there's nothing left to sustain. Until the Emperor, in his infinite mercy, releases me from service. But I don't think that will happen. I think I'm here forever, trapped in this half-life, my consciousness spread across the Vox network like a ghost in the machine. I think I died years ago, back on Tertius Infernum, when the bunker collapsed, and everything since has been some kind of afterlife, some purgatory where I'm condemned to serve eternally, processing the deaths of others, while my own death remains forever out of reach. The whispers tell me this is true, tell me I'm already lost, already damned, already beyond redemption. And when the official Vox chatter fades into static and the only voices I hear are the ones that shouldn't exist, I start to believe them. I am Vox Operator 7743 Kappa, though I remember having another name once, in another life that feels like someone else's memory. I am a tool of the Imperium, a component in the vast machine of war that spans the galaxy. I receive and transmit and process, and I will continue to do so until my systems fail beyond repair, or until the stars themselves burn out. This is my service. This is my duty. This is what it means to be a Vox Operator in the Imperium of man, to be stripped of your humanity, piece by piece, until nothing remains but the signal, the endless, eternal, all-consuming signal that screams through your skull every moment of every day, drowning out everything that made you human, everything that made you real. And in those rare moments when the Vox traffic lulls, when there's a brief gap in the transmissions, I can hear the silence underneath, not the blessed silence of peace or rest, but the terrible silence of the void, vast and empty and hungry. It's waiting for me, that silence, waiting for the moment when the augmetics finally give out and the machines release their hold on my failing meat. And I don't know if what waits in that silence is the Emperor's peace or something far worse, something that wears his name like a mask while offering only eternal service in a realm where death itself is no escape. But that doesn't matter either. Nothing matters except the next transmission, the next message to transcribe, the next order to relay. I am the Vox. I am the signal. I am the voice that speaks when men die, and the silence that follows when there's no one left to listen. This is what I am. This is what they made me. This is what it means to serve. The Vox crackles in my skull, a new message incoming, and my hands move to transcribe it before my conscious mind even registers the words. Somewhere, someone is dying. Somewhere, someone is calling for help that won't arrive in time. Somewhere, the Emperor's war grinds forward, consuming everything in its path. And I am here, in this bunker, in this body, in this machine, processing it all with the cold efficiency of a tool that knows nothing but function. The whispers rise beneath the official chatter, promising rest, promising silence, promising an end. I ignore them as I always do, as I always have, as I always will, because duty demands nothing less. I am a servant of the Imperium, and the Imperium's demands are absolute. There is no rest, no silence, no end, only the Vox, eternal and unchanging, the voice of humanity's endless war against a galaxy that wants us dead. This is my life. This is my death. This is my eternity. The signal never stops. The voices never cease. And I will continue to listen, continue to process, continue to transmit, until there's nothing left of me but machine and meat, and the fading echo of someone who once had a name, once had a mother, once had a chance at something resembling a human life, but that was long ago, in a different world, in a different life. Now there is only the Vox, only the mission, only the Emperor's work, stretching forward into an eternity of service and suffering, and the cold, mechanical clicking of the message transcriber as it captures another soldier's death for the historical record that no one will ever read. The Emperor protects, they say, but he doesn't protect me. He doesn't protect any of us. He uses us, consumes us, burns us up in the furnace of his eternal war, and we thank him for the privilege. Because what else is there? What else could there be in a galaxy where hope is heresy and mercy is weakness, and the only truth is the cold mathematics of survival? I transcribe another message, another death, another small tragedy in a war without end. My hands don't shake anymore. My voice doesn't waver. I am beyond such human frailties. I am the perfect tool, the ideal servant, the machine that the Imperium always wanted me to be, and if some fragment of the person I was still exists, buried deep beneath the augmetics and the stimulants and the years of accumulated trauma, it has learned to stay silent, learned that expression is pointless, learned that the only way to survive is to become nothing more than the function you serve. This is what it's like to be a Vox operator in Warhammer 40K. This is what they don't tell you when they come to the hives and select you for service. This is the price of hearing the Imperium's voice, of being connected to the vast network of human suffering that spans the stars. You don't die quickly. In battle, your body broken and your service ended. You die slowly, incrementally, losing yourself piece by piece, until there's nothing left but the machines and the voices and the endless, eternal signal that defines your existence. And the worst part, the part that they never mention in the imperial propaganda, is that you stop wanting it to end. You stop hoping for death or release, or even the smallest measure of peace. You become so accustomed to the pain, so adapted to the suffering, that the idea of existing without it becomes incomprehensible. The Vox is your world. The signal is your reality. The voices are more real than your own thoughts. And when you close your eyes and try to remember what silence sounded like, you find there's nothing there, just static, just the hiss of dead channels, just the echo of 1,000 dead men speaking in your skull. I am still transmitting, still receiving, still processing. The campaign continues around me, soldiers dying and fighting, and dying again in the Emperor's name. And I record it all, transcribe it all, reduce it all to neat little data packets that will be compiled into reports that no one will read. This is my purpose. This is my function. This is all I am and all I will ever be until the day the machines fail one final time and there's no tech adept left who cares enough to repair them. But that day is not today. Today I serve. Tomorrow I will serve. The day after that I will serve. Forever and ever, without end. Amen. The Emperor protects. The Emperor provides. The Emperor demands. And I, his faithful servant, his loyal tool, his obedient machine, continue to listen to the screaming of his Imperium and transcribe it into the official record of humanity's slow extinction. The Vox crackles. Another message. Another death. Another day in the service of the Golden Throne. I close my eyes, but there is no darkness behind my eyelids. Only the flickering images of Vox data streaming endlessly through my augmented consciousness. Only the voices, speaking their final words into the void. Only the signal, eternal and unchanging. The voice of the Imperium that will outlast every man, woman, and child who has ever lived or ever will live. This is what it's like. This is the truth they hide behind the glory and the propaganda and the promises of service. This is what happens when you give yourself to the Imperium. It takes everything and gives nothing back except the privilege of serving until there's nothing left to give. And even then, even when you're used up and broken and more machine than human, it will find a way to extract one more day, one more hour, one more transmission from your failing body before it finally lets you go, if it ever lets you go at all.